everybody flowed well together. And it was like that where, so here's what has to happen for that to really work out. For the leader of the group to be able to just throw the ball out and everybody just, first you got to have a secure leader that doesn't have to dominate everything. And Barry was, you know, he just sat there and you can just see he just didn't have anything. And the other thing is, sometimes in a meeting, it'll be flowing that way, and whoever is, you know, leading the meeting, if the ball needs a little, you know, it went out of bounds and somebody else, he'll throw it back in. And I mean, that's a good analogy because different things can happen in a meeting, but first of all, you've got to let them play. You got to trust them to, they don't need you to do everything. Cool. Happy 2020. Everybody good?
Yes.
Hey, I want you to begin to think, and I'm going to allow some time, hopefully, in just a little bit. Everybody's getting a message. Live stream, by the way, right now. Thank you, Patsy. If you'd rather not look at me and look at your screen, go ahead. Remember, the screen adds 10 pounds. Reminds me of that time on Friends. Remember Monica on Friends? That when she was younger, they always teased her that when she was younger, she was bigger than she was as she got older. And her boyfriend became, I'm dating myself, but remember Chandler was looking at an old picture and she said, well, remember the camera adds 10 pounds. He goes, well, how many cameras were on you? You don't want to say that. But I've always laughed about that. Today I want to talk to you, today's title might be up there, yeah. Talk to the hand. You ever heard that before?
Yes.
You ever heard that and they were serious about it? How old is that? Is that 2000s at least? Is it even before that? Jeez, I just can't believe it's that long. But I can remember, you know, the whole thing. And remember, it was a negative thing. It was like, talk to the hand because I'm not listening. That was the whole. And, you know, that's true sometimes. But I chose it just popped into my mind, honestly, yesterday as I was coming up with sermon titles. But I want us to look at it in a positive light. Because reality is, well, you'll understand more as we go. Okay? Just if you'll give me that liberty, you'll understand more as we go why I chose talk to the hand. You know, beginning in September, maybe even before that, we had begun to talk again about how in the Hebrew calendar in September at Rosh Hashanah, the Hebrew calendar went to a whole new decade. And 5779 went to 5780. How many of you remember and recall me talking about this before? In the 70s, 5771, 70, 71 through 79, in the Hebrew calendar, it was basically, and I'm going to try to summarize quick, it was basically about what you see. It was about sight, seeing through the eyes of God. And then we realized once it came into 5780 that the Hebrew number and letter and all, the pay was about the mouth. And now we were to speak what God showed us. Not that seeing was any diminished at all, but you were to take what you saw. And what he's saying is, in this new dispensation, we need to be aware that there is great authority, life and death, in the power of the tongue. And that we're to be careful and be responsible for what we say. Amen. So we've covered all that. I began to realize earlier this week that how many of you have gathered your decrees and you begin to speak to mountains and you've been begin to, like we did this morning, speak to chains and just use your words. Do you realize that you can get that list and leave God out of it? You see, what this is all about is ongoing relationship. It's not saying, okay, God showed me once and now I'm just going to take my list and I'm going to meet my quota for the day. You can make it into a work real fast. Sure. So it's really, let's remind ourselves that this is more about relationship and saying what he says to say. It's not striking off your list per se, Always breathe life into your list. Even if you use a list and you need a reminder, that's okay. Your prayer list, your different things the reminders that you want to, you've got an ongoing health crisis, or you've got an ongoing thing, a relationship issue, whatever it is. It's okay to have a list, especially those obscure things. I have a lot of times people say, hey Darren, will you pray for this? Hey Darren, will you remember this? And honestly, if I don't write it down, you're not going to get prayed for. And Joy has actually taught me, as soon as they leave, I pray right then. So at least get one in there, because I'm not always in a place where I can write it down until I remember it. You understand?
Sure.
So it's nothing wrong with having a list, but just always remind yourself that this is an ongoing, you're to speak what he says speak. So therefore you have to have eyes to see and ears to hear. See, the decade of the vision was just the first step. I was reminded, remember in Jeremiah chapter 1, when Jeremiah was called, do you remember this story? In Jeremiah chapter 1, starting in about verse 4, it talks about the first time God spoke to him and called him to be a seer, a prophet. And he said, I'm going to call you, and he said, make sure you say what I tell you to say, because Jeremiah, his ministry overlapped with Isaiah. It was during the time that they were getting ready to go into exile. They were getting ready to go to Babylonian captivity. And there was great unrest in Judah. They were a mess. And so for someone to stand up and speak the way God saw things, they were going to be in opposition to the status quo of their little world there. So here's young Jeremiah. God's telling him, I'm raising you up to see, and now I want you to speak what I want you to speak. You see the correlation here. Mm-hmm. It's a prophetic picture for us for the time that we're in. Not that we're not all called to be in the office of the prophet, but was Jesus a prophet? Sure. Was Jesus an evangelist? Was Jesus a pastor, teacher, apostle? Yes, Jesus was all those things. He's in you, you're in him. So you have the authority to speak as long as you're listening. Mm-hmm. As long as you're seeing what he sees. Mm-hmm. Remember, even Jesus himself in his earthly ministry, he said, I only say what I hear the Father say. Mm-hmm. I only do what I see the Father do. So it's both seeing, hearing, being aware, perceive the direction of the Lord, and then releasing it on earth. Mm-hmm. That's our place, right? We've all kind of come to that conclusion. Let me take you one step further. I saw this earlier this week. In fact, I stole this from Lance Wallnow, if anybody likes him. I was already, it's amazing how God will lead you in a direction, and he'll begin to create thoughts in your mind. And then you think it's a random click. And it just lays out for you. Mm-hmm. Did you know this? Now, realize we've been looking at the Hebrew calendar as well as our Gregorian calendar, right? Mm-hmm. 2020 versus 5780, right? It took me a long time to realize that AD didn't mean after dead. Right. Did y'all know that? If AD means after dead, we lost 33 years there somewhere. But what it means, AD means after descended, right? Do you know that? That'll help you out. But you never thought of that before, did you? That's why a lot of the secular society are trying to get rid of the Gregorian calendar, because it acknowledges the existence of God. We got to wipe him out. We got to get him out of society. We've got to have a new calendar. But for purposes, it's still in place. It's 2020. Do you realize that even on the Gregorian calendar, it's not completely secular because it's tied to Jesus' birth, his descension, and then it's just incredible to me. It's not just all secular is evil. Jesus is in the midst of all of it. Have you ever looked up the number 20 in the Hebrew? This is interesting. And what's so cool about this was I was already going in this direction. The number 20 in Hebrew is the word kaf. K-A-P-H. And the symbol for that is the hand. So he not only wants us to see with his eyes and speak what he tells us to speak, but he also wants us to be active with our hands. And how active? 20. We're going to have both hands working. As we come into this decade, I haven't even told Joy this.
That's cool.
As we come into this, we've got to realize it's time to go to work. It's not time to just think, oh, okay, I'll just speak it out and God will take care of it. No, he's saying, I want you to be active in this. But you have to first see what I'm showing you. You have to have an intimacy with me. That begins and ends everything. How much time are we going to allow him to influence our hearts? How much are we willing to allow him to speak to our hearts? Gain that relationship. Gain the trust. Oh, I'm hearing. This morning I saw a thing on the Elijah list. It was from a daughter of someone I met years ago, and she teaches dream interpretation and things. And she had this fabulous article about how she made it really simple. And as I read her method, it reminded me of the dream workshop that Dee did years ago. And her methods were very similar. So not even thinking about what time it was, I sent it to Dee, and then I thought, oh, I hope she's awake. But it wasn't that early, was it? It was about 8:30 or so. But the interesting thing was, a portion of the article was this family in California. She had done a seminar in California. It was Mark Verkler's daughter. You remember Mark Verkler that he came to the church, taught us how to journal? It was his daughter. Anyway, she had done this seminar in California. And there was one family there that they were kind of like Dee's family. You'll hear Beth and Dee and Sam's this way, but their family are dreamers. Carrie's a dreamer. Me, not so much, as much as that's how God speaks to them. It's just a different way that he speaks. But this family were dreamers. And so they had a set of twins that were 10, and then they had this little boy that was 8, and they sat on the front row and they were just all in because that was how God spoke to their hearts. So they were interested to figure out, how do I understand? How do I interpret what he's saying? How do I know this is not just a random dream? Or how do I know it's God? And so she made it so simple that the 8-year-old little boy that went back to school began to share it with his friends. And one kid told him about a thing that was, and she just made it so simple for him that he found out the root cause. He found out what was going on and the abiding emotion that was going on. She walked him through, and he was able to, 8 years old, to comprehend how to do it. And he brought deliverance to a whole family that had just gone through a terrible thing with their grandfather. But this little boy had had a dream, and the other little boy didn't know the dream. He didn't know what was going on in their family, and he shared with them, and it created new relationships. It was a fabulous thing. God is speaking if we have ears to hear. Amen. I want to take you to Ephesians chapter 1. Last week we looked at the whole chapter. I want to take you to one verse. Cassie was making fun of me. I'm going to tell on her. She's making fun of me this morning. She said, I had to look at it twice, or I don't know how you said it. She couldn't believe I just got one verse. Yes, that's what. Yeah. Now remember, last week we looked at the whole chapter, but this is verse 18. Now you have to remember, in the King James, I like how they did in the Passion Translation. They remind you here in verse 18 that he's praying. The prayer started 3 verses before. It goes actually from 15 to 19, and every now and again in the Passion Translation, he reminds you, hey, I'm still praying. This is what my prayer is. Okay, but this is the one in King James says, I pray that the eyes of your understanding being enlightened in the knowledge of him, that whole thing. This is the Passion Translation. He says, I pray that the light of God, the illumination, for you to be able to perceive, give you the ability to see, hear, whatever way he can communicate. I pray that the light of God will illuminate the eyes of your imagination. That's the same word in King James, that's your understanding. Both words are very appropriate. Both words kind of describe a different aspect. The eyes of your understanding, the eyes of your imagination. Those of you that got your Christmas card this year for me. If you didn't, sorry, I forgot to bring them this week. I didn't give you yours yet. I think I got 2 for you. Last year's 2. Let's make a note. They skip every Christmas. Every Christmas. Too many presents. Cut them off. But your Christmas cards this year, I highlighted those few verses because I felt like God was saying this is a word for your church. He wants us to lean into Him and open up our hearts, our minds, our imaginations, our understandings, and allow Him to show us. He's got things for us to do this year. Amen. Individually. And see, individually, we make corporately.
That's good. Yeah.
We're all together in this because we have all decided God wants us here. Hopefully, everyone here is not here just because I've guilted you into it. That's one thing that came out on Wednesday night. That was kind of actually, Mason was the icebreaker. And I loved that because it was a young person. Mason had just a key point about how thankful he was that we can be real with each other, and you're allowed to have issues. Mm-hmm. You're allowed to have, and you're allowed to share them, and people actually can try to help you walk through them. And the other thing that came out was the fact that we appreciate that we're in a place that if you're not here one Sunday, nobody's looking at you cross-eyed, and you don't take that attitude yourself. That was something else that he was talking about, because when you're in that atmosphere, and yeah, you've been there every Sunday and every time the doors were open, you get that attitude. It just breeds. So because I don't have that attitude, hopefully none of us do. Do I want you here every time the doors, every time? Sure. But if something's going on, I'm just going to assume, I've just chosen to assume, you're out ministering somewhere. You've got something that God's told you. And if you're just laying out, stop. But I got better things to do than worry about your church attendance. Right. So that's all I got to say about that. But I am thankful that we're in a place that's free that way.
Yes.
Because one of the biggest hindrances in the body of Christ is that too many times manipulation and control is used to guilt you. That does not represent the Lord in a right way.
Right.
That does not represent the Lord. So, anyway, I pray that the light of God will illuminate the eyes of your imagination, flooding you with light. Flooding. Mm-hmm. See, that's my prayer, that you get flooded with light, with understanding. I don't know if you've ever been flooded with God speaking to your heart. And there's times you got to just say, God, hang on a second. I'm processing this. You ever been there? Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. I've been in meetings to where you go and you spend your money and you take your vacation time and you get a hotel and certain speakers speak to you, and some of my early mentors, when I would go to their meetings, and especially when we were on the road with them, I was on the road with them. After you sat through session after session and evening meeting for days in a row, usually about midway on Wednesday, I had so much I would take a meeting off just so I could process, because I could get overwhelmed with just information and I didn't want it to just go. And I could always get back then we had tapes, I could always get the tape of that session because I would get flooded. I would get inundated with things that God was speaking, and then I've found that true in my own personal study time. Mm-hmm. There are times when I'm studying that I have to just stop and I'll actually play solitaire. Doesn't look real spiritual, but what I'm doing is I'm processing. I have to do something mindless and then I go right back in. I hope that you understand what I'm talking about. He says, flooding you with light until you experience the full revelation of the hope of His calling. That is the wealth of God's glorious inheritance that He finds in us, His holy ones. You see, there's a lot there in that scripture.
Mm-hmm.
It was a typo. It was only one. It really wasn't a typo. But realize this verse is not just an ordinary verse. That's why I gave it to you. I gave you 3 or 4 to think about on your Christmas card this year. I want you to chew on them. I want you to dissect it. I want you to personalize it, because, see, this is God's prayer for the intended reader. And as I explained last week, this letter that's called Ephesians chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, it wasn't just intended to go to the Ephesians. This letter was intended to be shared with the other churches within the area. This wasn't just, you'll notice this church mentions nobody, this letter mentions no one's name. This letter mentions nothing but how to know God. It's all doctrinal. And this letter was meant to be like an elementary spiritual 101, New Covenant 101 letter that was to be passed around to help people come out of Judaism or come out of paganism. This is your covenant with God. That's what Ephesians is. It's a very, very instructional for the new believer. If you're new, even if you've been around a while, like I told them last week, every now and again you need to run through Ephesians again. Ephesians is one of those foundational letters that you've got to realize this explains Jesus' covenant. And it's all about, in that first chapter that we looked at last week, we dissected over and over and over, from start to finish. The highlight was him in you, you in him. Your identity in him, that it's all enveloped in that you are one. As far as God's perception is, he is in you, you are in him. It's a oneness that took place the moment you believe. And that's basic, elementary grace gospel. Amen?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I want us to understand that we are in a time frame. Actually, I said all that to say this. We are in a time frame that things are going to elevate and things are going to accelerate very, very quickly. Barry's starting to rub off on me. I was in the bathroom the other day. Let me just say this, not in the shower. I thought about this morning. I'm not throwing stones at anybody since I'm putting myself in the bathroom area to hear God, but could it be that that's the only place we don't have an electronic device?
You don't take it.
Yes, it does.
You gotta tell everything you know. Oh, is it getting hot in here? But anyway,
So much for that.
the bathroom downstairs, if you've ever been in my house, it's the laundry room as well. So, so there. But anyway, that's where I was, in that room in the back of the house. And it just hadn't dawned on me. I heard roaring 20s. And it was significant. It wasn't just, over the years, I've learned when it's just my thoughts or when it's the Lord, and usually when it's the Lord, it won't leave you alone. It's flooding you. So ever since that day, this was early in the week, I've been looking for the comparisons of what I know historically what took place in the United States in the era that we call the Roaring 20s. Let me just share with you a little bit, because there's more to this than what I'm even going to be able to share today. I want to allow some time. If any of you have had imaginations, have been thinking about along these same lines, what you're seeing, then I'm going to welcome that. But let me show you some comparisons. From that time to this, that was exactly 100 years ago. Realize they called it the Roaring 20s because there was money everywhere. They had just come out of World War I, and manufacturing in the teens, or 1915 through. We made all the weapons for World War I. There was money to be had. In the 20s, marked the first time that there were more people living in cities than living in a rural setting. The 20s was kind of like what we spoke about last year when we were talking about the European Renaissance period. The 20s for America was our Renaissance. There were so many inventions. That's when we got the pop-up toaster. But let's look at it in a spiritual way. That's when Henry Ford changed the way he built cars and made the assembly line. In the beginning of the 20s, there was hardly any cars compared to, by the end of the 20s, everybody had a car. And they all happened to be Model Ts, you know, so Henry Ford did good. He's probably still living off that money. Let's think about this, though, the other things that took place. And let me remind you some things that I've shared with you before. For the last several years, I've told you that I see a time coming where we have to prepare in our hearts for abundance. We have to be ready to be affluent. And I'm not just talking about money, but money too. You realize money can destroy you if you're not ready for it. Just watch the lottery things. You can tell the people that get destroyed by money. You have to be ready to have a means of wealth. You have to have your heart ready that the things that you're able to buy don't consume you. You can be so that even though God can put us into this position, we can leave him in no time. Just look at the nation of Israel and their history. We've got that same DNA. We can do that. It seems like as believers a lot of times when we find out that, oh, we got a good president and he's doing okay, let's just go back to sleep. No, it's time to see, speak, and then we better vote. We better put our voices out there. I'm not saying start arguments, don't fight with Aunt, Grandma, whatever, you know, the cousin I'm not saying start arguments, but what I'm saying is you better have a voice, you better have something to counter, because your children are at stake and your families are at stake. You understand? Remember the flappers? Let's look at the mistakes they make. Women, for the first time, raised up in the 20s. Not all in a good way, but some of it turned in the 20s when the women got the right to vote. In the 20s is when the radio really became very, very, very popular. And in the 20s is when the black folks first stood up and had a voice. That's when jazz was real prevalent. That's when, you know, they finally said, hey, we're not gonna go back on the plantations anymore. Now realize it took a number of years after that for things to really get going. But that was the beginning part. Is when white culture began to embrace their music.
Right.
You see, we liked it. Jazz was, how many of you like jazz today? I kind of like it. I don't understand it all, but I kind of like it. Let's look at it politically. I'm not going to dwell on this, but do you understand the roaring 20s with its flappers and all the things that was going on? You know, they just got off track and they allowed their affluence to make them lazy. And it was all about entertainment. Do you realize that the average American, 90% of Americans in the 20s went to the movie theater once a week, every week? It's all about entertainment. Now we have entertainment right here. We're worse about entertainment than they ever thought about being. We have entertainment at the click of a button. It reveals your heart real fast. Look at your history. You can tell what you're interested in. Do you understand that because of the manufacturing that took place in the teens of the 1900s, the 19-teens, that it led them right into a great decade, that by 1929 everything crashed. The Great Depression started in 1929. and lasted for about 10 years. And politically, there was a spiritual thing going on, really is what it was. There was a spiritual thing going on, and we've just renamed it, but it was progressivism. I'm not a real, what you call political kind of guy, but it is what it is. You saw a man named Woodrow Wilson completely destroy this country and throw us into the throngs of depression. All the affluence, all the prosperity that was going on was thrown away in a moment of time through social responsibility. Free money. We've got to learn a lesson. We've got to remember the words of Sir Edmund Burke. Remember I told you, those who do not know history are destined to repeat it. Those who do not know history are destined to repeat it. So as we gather more and more prosperity, as our ministries grow, as our voices get louder in our communities, as favors doors open to us, let's not forget who brought us here. Let's not make the mistakes and go off and forget that garnering voice, that voice that'll keep us steady and stable, keep us focused. We cannot forget that voice of God, that relationship with God, and go out and building our own ideas. Honey, he's not responsible to provide where he doesn't guide.
That's right.
He's not. We have to be mindful. Even when a door looks good, I've heard different people say this. Yeah. Even when a door looks good, ministers, you better pray into it first. Even if it's a door you've been believing God for, you better make sure it's the right time and God's saying go.
That's true. That's right.
You got to check and balance everything you do. You don't want to just, and you know, as you maintain that relationship as your first priority, it's not a hard thing to know when it's and when it's It's not like you got to fast 3 days and, ask 16 people to pray for you. If you'll just maintain that relationship, if you might need to take an inventory, are you where in your relationship where you want to be? If not, just make some steps. Just don't do the guilt thing. Oh, he's mad at me. I know I've not been around. No, he's not. He's not even in a bad mood. That's what Barry said.
So true.
Quoting Andrew Womack. But that is true. We can't allow the lie called guilt to keep us from spending time with the Lord in whatever way he speaks to you. Now, if you're a dreamer, don't sleep all day thinking he's going to give you. I'm not saying that. The greatest way he speaks to all of us is through his word. I pray that whether you like to listen to someone else read the word to you, or if you like to read it yourself, if you like good teachers, but I pray that the eyes of your understanding would be more and more enlightened in the knowledge of him. You see, it has to be sight, hearing, and then speaking what he shows you, what you hear him say. But it is also, we better be ready to put our hands to work. It's time. It's that time. And let's not get so bogged down with other things while we're waiting. Make sure everything you do in this preparation time, as we're going in, make sure the things that you're even doing now you should still be doing. If you need to cut something off, it's just an old season. You don't keep doing things just because that's what you always did. You do it because if it's lost its life, if it's lost its luster, you don't just do it because, oh, that's the way we've always done it. You don't do that. You don't do that. You don't do that in your worship times. You don't do that in church, but you don't do that in your life. When God's not breathing on it, and I'm not saying just because you don't like it anymore. I've been doing a few things the last few years I don't really care about doing, but I feel like that's where God's got me and that's where I'm staying. But I'm saying there are times when God's done with something and you know that you're just there because you're afraid of change. Don't fall into that.
Wow.
Don't fall into that, because you're not just hurting you. You're hurting your families, everybody you go to church with. You're hurting your next generations. So let's just maintain that focus. Maintain the fact that God is watching us and trying to help us and trying to lead us and guide us and give us understanding. And then just walk it out. It's eyes and ears. And then we do need to emphasize that we need to speak those things. We need to talk to those things that have hindered us. Even the prophetic word that was delivered this morning about chains, you need to think about what chains are hindering you and yours. You don't have to tell everybody what they are, but begin to speak to them. Tell them, get out of the way. Act like Jesus would act. Act like who you are. You are the saints. Isn't that what he said? The only saint thing about you is Jesus. You understand? The only holy thing about you is Jesus. So if he's telling you to speak, it's just like that reference I gave you before. When God called Jeremiah and said, I've known you from your mother's womb. I've called you to be a prophet. And Jeremiah's first instinct while he was young, he said, oh, I'm just young. I'm of unclean lips. And you know what happened there? He was called to be a seer, and he was called to speak. And then when he said, oh, I can't, God's hand came down and cleansed his lips. I told you months ago, God had been speaking to me about my mouth. And at first, I was all concerned, how am I going to control my mouth? And then I realized, oh, I can't. See that? Yeah. We said children are more sensitive. Yeah. It's only God that can clean up the way you talk. If we'll just keep it simple. If you need to shore up that relationship that you have with the Lord, that ongoing dialogue, just do it. And everything will flow easier. If you'll do one thing, it'll just flow easier.
Amen.
Talk to your hands. Not in that negative way. Talk to the hand. My head's not listening. No. Speak and allow your hands to do the work. Talk to your hands. Now, before we go, I want you to understand, and I've just realized this. My favorite prophetic voice in many ways is that lady from Australia, Lana Vosser. She's just been, God's just allowed me to have her as a gift. It kept me sane on some days, because it was as if she knew my phone number. She came out with a word yesterday that I'll let you read for yourself. It's not the first time she said this, but it's the first time I tied it to this. She speaks of the fact that Jesus is beginning to manifest himself as the Lion of Judah. And she's speaking of the roar of the Lion of Judah. And I put it together this morning. I can't say I, you know what I mean. I realized this morning that when we speak of the roaring 20s, we were speaking of the speed of the 20s, how everything changed real fast. That's part of this as well. But there's also the meaning of the word roaring, where it's speech. And as you read the word Lana Vosser had on Elijah List, it came out late yesterday. She speaks of a roar that when you share that intimate time with the Lord, there becomes, you just begin to say what he says. And there is a declaration, a decree, a roar. How tired are you of those chains that's hindered your family? How tired are you that you can go to your grandpa's grandpa and he was a drunk and he was a drunk and he was a drunk and then you've got this. See, that's my lineage. I don't know about you. On my mama's side, they were all drinkers. You realize my mom had 5 brothers and sisters. Every one but her were alcoholics. And as she went through therapy and different things, she realized that in some senses, so was she. She had the predisposition for that. And there are things that depending on your genetic makeup and your, the way you were raised, and we are predisposed to certain things that you have to break that chain. You have to break that thing off. And I'm glad to say, I have 2 brothers and a sister. None of us are in that today, that I know of. At least they're all holding jobs anyway. I got a couple uncles that could work drunk too, but that's a whole other story. But what you need to understand is, don't just settle. Don't just put up with things. If you've been sick and tired and it got a little better, don't say, well, I'm just thankful for where I'm at, and leave it at that. Keep on talking to that thing. I know Joy and I, she's going through a great season right now, health-wise. I mean, over the last few weeks, right now we're doing great, and we've not had any sickness for a few months. But even the aches and pains she does have, even though we're thankful for where she's at, we're not settling for that.
That's right.
We're not settling. We're thankful for the decrease. Yeah. But we're not waiting until she runs that half marathon. We're still, we're still working on it. We're still talking. We're still declaring wholeness. Amen.
Yeah.
Before we go, I want to just give you at least the opportunity. Is there anybody that senses anything going on, whether it's just your personal, you've got ideas of what God's going to do with you? I feel like I could go around the room today and I sense something, but I don't really feel the liberty to do it. But I want you to, let's all rub off on one another today and allow the Spirit of God to. Is there some things that God's been speaking to you that you see that's going to happen? Is there some things even within our church that you might see? Is there some things that He's speaking to you personally? I'm just going to open the floor for a second. Anybody got anything you want to share? Abby, you got anything? No? Okay. I just like to tease Abby.
I just feel like this is the year that the things, I shared with a lot of people that the song that God gave me to take it off the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like this is a year that God is going to begin to do those things that He's proclaimed in us through the years. It's just, I don't know, it's just going to be a different year.
It just seems like it's time.
It's time, yeah.
It has a different feel to it right now. What are you guys thinking? You guys got anything you want to?
The Lord is throwing my life totally upside down. I've been flooded with ideas and information that I can't even contain. But
Flooded.
what you were talking about
It's awesome.
has been happening to me to where I just had to quit, and I also do solitaire.
Yeah, it's just
Sometimes you have to. Sometimes you actually get too flooded. You don't know how to maintain all. And where I was thankful for all the ideas.
What do you do first?
Right, it had to be categorized.
Yeah.
And so that's where the phone came in, and the Lord started having me break it down, just like I learned to break down dreams. I have to learn now to break down the flooding ideas that He's bringing us into, and it's going to change our whole life.
Yeah.
And you have been directly speaking to me all day. Started out this morning with the text, but especially your sermon. Directly, you even pointed at me when I needed to hear that crucial statement. Basically, you were saying all your preparation needs to be how he has spoken it to you, and keep the main thing,
Mhm.
basically, you
Yeah.
know,
So true.
and how he communicates with you, and it will flip-flop our life, I know it will.
Mhm.
I've been so flooded, I can't even convey
Yeah.
what I'm getting to him, but he knows there's a change coming. We've known there's a
Right.
change coming, but this will totally set us on a different path, financially, business-wise, spiritually, corporately.
Mhm.
It will affect all of us
Mhm.
in some light.
You got anything to share, Norris? You got any ideas, things that
No, I've just kind of moved from the
Christmas,
rush
yeah.
to
Yeah. Right.
taxes now.
Oh, okay. I'll leave you alone for a moment. I do know a good accountant if you need. I can tell you who not to go to too. Anybody else got anything? Carrie, you got anything exciting about your book?
On my book. It's in progress. We're praying. I mean, I know I talked to you guys about the publishing and everything, and you know, we found a publisher, and just praying that God will open the doors in that way for us to be able to continue. That's probably about it right now on the book. As far as
But you know, I watch you guys and your influence in your little community. And, you know, I pull up every Sunday morning and pick up Tristan. So every Sunday morning, if not different times during the week, you know, I'm through there. And the boys had put up, was it Mother's Day?
my birthday,
Birthday. So that was August.
September.
September. It seems like a long time ago. I know it was. Anyway, it just seemed like it was longer ago, but they erected her a thing she calls the blessing box, and you know, they've got some people in their little community that doesn't have the means to get things, and so different people. I mean, they see people all the time, not only taking things out but putting things in. It's an avenue for people to minister, co-labor in a way, and just what a fabulous thing right there. So that's pretty interesting, and it gives them opportunities to share the Lord with neighbors. And
We just had a lady there 3 days ago that I ended up standing outside. It was a little cold. I was out there for probably 30 minutes with this lady, and she's talking, and she used to be a firefighter, and a volunteer firefighter, and she had these good, and was in the military, and had these great jobs and everything, and circumstance happened, something happened, and she had a disorder that she was unaware of, and ended up self-medicating through drugs, got on drugs, and she's telling me all this, and so now she's clean, and she's out, and she's successful, and she's trying to rebuild her relationship with her children, because her children were very blessed that they didn't see any of that, and her parents had stepped in and kind of sheltered them from that.
She had some help then. Thank
Right,
goodness,
and
yeah.
now she's back there, and she was, and we got to talk, and she was like, and her worth was down, and I mean, I got to stand there, and it all started because she said, explain this to me.
Mhm.
What is this? This is awesome. I'd like to do this. And she started talking about her worth. She's like, I know I'm not who I was, and she started talking about all that and everything. And just got to speak into her for probably close to 30 minutes about, who she is, and it doesn't have to be these big miraculous things
Right.
that
Just little things.
it's the little things, and she even opened up to me about the struggles of the son seeing her in the new light versus the old
Right.
person that she was and everything. And I mean, so we got to speak a lot of that. She connected with us on Facebook and like the same day and everything. So it just opened so many.
So is she local? Is she there?
She actually is not. Yeah, she's in Ohio. But she just happened to be
Wow, and that's
in the neighborhood, walking by, was visiting somebody and walking to the
and
store.
you were outside. And,
I happened to be outside, and she stopped and started asking questions. I mean, I love this God moments where
right.
it's just He orchestrates
Yeah.
these things, and so that was that was really exciting. I think a great connection. We seem to have had a lot through that kind of stuff. So.
Well, before I close, anybody got anything burning in your heart? Cassie, what's going on with you?
Baby.
Why?
Well, yeah, we have.
Tell me about this business. This is the first I'm hearing about it. Can we talk about it in front of people?
Yeah.
Okay.
We
They ain't nobody. Girls.
we had kind of started this last year. Tony's getting more into like woodworking and doing different things, and just one thing after another. We had seen some things. Basically, we just aren't real happy that, you know, he works a lot, he's gone a lot, and still we can't barely pay our bills, you know.
Right.
So not only do we not see him, we also have no money. So there's just got to be a better way to do this. But so I had run across something online, and it was kind of a little online workshop for getting started as like a handyman, starting your own business and keeping the costs low, and you know, the best ways to, you know, all the things you have to look at and costs and different things. So we are, you know, we're registered as a business, and we're with the state of West Virginia. We're just kind of walking through that process right now, and it'll be like on the side as in addition to work right now. But you know, just like God's just really been on both of us, like, yeah, let's do something different. Let's, you know, I don't know, we'll see how it goes and see where he takes it. But
Well, as we close, I just feel like I want to pray for them. Can we all just pray for them? And I'm even going to tell you beforehand, I don't know all that I'm going to pray because I haven't started yet. But I just want to pray that you have an assurance that, you know, this is where you're supposed to go. And of course, Tony's on board because he's the one that's really, but he's the man, you know, he's so I just want to bless you. Is that okay? And if anybody has any, you know, anything else to pray, please do.
That's the reason why we started our business, and I've owned and operated 3. He can do it. He can do it. He's God led. He will take you every step of the way. You will find favor.
The thing is, when you're doing a business, and they can tell you this, your name's everything. So, you know, I know Tony. Tony was raised by Big Tony. He'll do a good job. So that'll open doors for you. God's favor will open doors because the character that's already instilled in you is a godly character, and it will open doors. And word of mouth, good word of mouth will open a multitude of doors. And you just always be mindful of, you know, when you're having a rough day and starting out, it's a little hard because you've worked all day and you want to be home. It's like I wasn't home enough before, but getting started, there's going to be that little crunch time. But maintain your heart, because it'll be easy to be short with people and quiet and distant, and your natural bent is to be quiet. But as you're stepping out in business, you're gonna have to allow Tony to shine, and you're gonna have to allow. But at the same time, you're there to work, not to talk to him. You know, so. Anyways, anybody else got anything to say to him?
Why are you looking at me like that?
Nah, I'm just kidding. I just like to mess with you.
We have a whole list. You can come over. And
Yeah.
Shirley, I gotta take this Shirley.
Oh, Shirley's first on the list?
I was
Okay.
thinking, I'll be the first one.
Okay.
Handyman.
You got anything?
It's good, it's gonna be real good. It's gonna be real good.
What is it, baby?
He said he would bless the desires of our heart. And he places the desire there. And it's a godly desire. Her desire is to be with her children. And her desire is, his desire is to be with his children. And God says he will bless the desire for them. He says he blesses our hands. So, this is going to be a